Welcome, friends, and let me take you straight into a paradox that has baffled Western economists for more than a decade. This morning, while commentators in Washington and London repeat their tired forecasts about China's inevitable collapse, something very different is happening on the ground. Prices in China are falling not suddenly, not chaotically, but slowly, consistently, and across entire sectors. And that is precisely the detail Western analysts cannot wrap their minds around. Because in their world, deflation is a nightmare. In their world, falling prices signal doom. But what if the world they are describing is simply not the one China is living in? You see, when Western experts talk about deflation, they're not just giving you an economic concept. They're describing the fragility of their own system. A system built on towering mountains of debt, inflated stock values, asset bubbles that must rise forever or crumble instantly. In that system, if prices fall, profits shrink. If profits shrink, debts become harder to pay back. If debts can't be paid back, banks buckle under losses. And if banks start collapsing, the whole house comes down fast. That is the shadow haunting Western capitalism, and it colors every prediction they make. So when these same voices look at China with its steady, persistent deflation, they expect to see the same chain reaction: lower prices, lower profits, distressed borrowers, distressed lenders, recession, contagion, crash. They assume China must be standing on the same fault line they are. But let me tell you, China is not standing on that fault line at all. The terrain under its feet is built differently, and the rules that apply in the West simply do not fit the structure of China's economy. Let's start with the basics. China's deflation is not coming from collapsing demand. It's coming from supply-side strength, a flood of efficiency, scale, and capability that keeps pushing costs downward, access to raw materials on a global scale, infrastructure networks that move goods at breathtaking speed, electricity that is both abundant and increasingly cheap, a labor force becoming more educated while staying far more affordable than its Western counterparts. These are not signs of a system cracking. These are signs of a system sharpening, and the impact is visible everywhere. Consumer goods are getting cheaper, not because companies are desperate, but because factories are producing more, better, and faster. Household electronics, clothing, appliances, whole categories of goods are being churned out at volumes the West can only dream of. Western economists look at that and see a crisis. Chinese economists look at that and see the outcome of deliberate policy. And that's the point. Deflation in China is not a market accident. It is the byproduct of industrial policy, a result of decades of investment in logistics, energy, education, and manufacturing scale. In the West, efficiency is supposed to enrich shareholders. In China, efficiency is supposed to enrich the entire productive system. Those are two different civilizations of finance, two different visions of what an economy is for. So here's the irony. Western observers keep insisting China is growing despite deflation. But the truth, the uncomfortable truth, is that China is growing because of it. The falling prices are not the warning sign. They are the outcome. They are the evidence of supply chains so competitive that costs must fall. And in a financial system built on state-owned banks rather than private profit-chasing institutions, falling prices do not trigger the same panic. There is no Lehman Brothers moment waiting in the shadows. There is coordination, not chaos. And as we open this story today, that's the paradox I want you to sit with. One world fears falling prices because it destroys borrowed wealth. Another world sees falling prices as the natural result of industrial strength. It's time we admit the uncomfortable truth. We may be using the wrong map to navigate a new economic continent. Let's move deeper into this story, because what looks like a simple debate about prices is actually a window into two competing economic philosophies. And nowhere is that contrast clearer than in how China's financial system responds, or rather refuses, to panic when profits tighten and consumer prices drift downward. In the West, shrinking margins are treated as an early tremor before the earthquake. In China, they're treated as a sign that the system is working exactly as intended. That's a hard truth for Western analysts to hear, but it's essential if we want to understand what's unfolding. Let me show you what I mean. In the Western model, profits are everything. They drive investment, they drive share prices, they drive executive bonuses, and they drive the political influence of corporations. When profits drop, stock markets tremble, politicians worry, and commentators rush onto television to declare a crisis. Now compare that with a system where the major banks are state-owned, where credit is guided towards strategic sectors, and where the objective isn't maximizing shareholder gains, but maximizing national productive capacity. In that kind of system, lower profits may feel uncomfortable, but they do not threaten the foundation of the economy. And that difference matters. Because while Western institutions brace themselves for every deflationary signal, Chinese banks continue lending, continue expanding capacity, and continue supporting the very industries whose falling prices are scaring Western observers. There is no domino effect waiting to topple the system. No bank CEO desperately hiding losses, no shadowy derivatives trade that could erase billions overnight. Instead, there is continuity, a continuity the West mistakes for fragility simply because it does not resemble their own experience. Now, let's talk about the CKGSB data. The surveys of thousands of Chinese executives who live inside these supply chains, their business conditions index shows something striking. Intermediate goods prices are falling sharply month after month, with readings deep below 50. In the Western model, this would prompt an emergency meeting at a central bank, but in China, it signals that the cost base of the entire economy is becoming more competitive. Goods move cheaper, energy flows cheaper, logistics operate cheaper. And when costs fall across the board, final consumer prices fall too, as the 47.9 reading from their consumer price index makes clear. To Western observers, the reaction is predictable. Falling producer prices plus falling consumer prices equals shrinking profits. And shrinking profits equals danger. But let's pause here. Let's remember something fundamental. Profits shrinking in China does not mean the economy is shrinking. It means rent seeking, the extraction of wealth without adding value, is being squeezed out. It means efficiency is rising faster than executives can mark up their goods. It means competition is doing what competition is supposed to do: lower prices for consumers, pressure companies to innovate, and prevent inflated margins from becoming permanent. You see, the Western model has taught us to worship high profits, but high profits often come from bottlenecks, monopolies, and barriers, not from genuine progress. China's model, for all its flaws, pushes in the opposite direction. It expands supply until bottlenecks break. It invests in infrastructure until logistical constraints disappear. It directs credit until industries grow, not at the pace of shareholders' desires, but at the pace required to reshape global markets And all of this brings us to the real shock. Deflation in China is not chaos. It is strategy. It is the outcome of an economy that prioritizes scale over speculation, production over paper wealth, long-term capacity over short-term excitement. Western economists see a system flirting with danger, but Chinese executives see a system clearing out inefficiencies and preparing for the next industrial leap. And this is where the irony turns sharp. Because while Western forecasters warn that China's dangerous deflation will crash its economy, China continues exporting cheaper goods, building faster trains, refining larger energy grids, and scaling industries. The West outsourced decades ago. The West accuses China of being too efficient, too productive, too competitive. Think about that. We live in a world where economic success has become a threat, at least to those who design their systems around permanent inflation and permanent debt. And that's the broader theme emerging. Two economic worlds diverging. One built on rising prices and shrinking production. Another built on falling prices and expanding capability. One world dependent on debt-fueled consumption, another world dependent on supply-driven gains. It's time we stop pretending these two systems operate under the same rules. Now let's widen the lens, because this story is no longer just about prices or business surveys or even the contrast between economic models. It is about something far larger, a global shift in how economic power is built, maintained, and defended. And that shift becomes unmistakable when we look at what Western policymakers expected to happen in China and what actually happened. For years, Washington and Brussels insisted that China's real estate downturn would be its undoing. They remembered 2008. They remembered how their own housing bubble ignited a global crisis. They believed the same script would play out in Beijing. A property slowdown, they said, would rip through Chinese banks, freeze consumer confidence, topple developers, and drag the entire nation toward collapse. But let me tell you, the script didn't repeat itself. The crash never arrived. The contagion never spread. Instead, something almost unthinkable occurred. The real estate cooling became a release valve. It freed up household budgets. It redirected credit. And it opened space for industrial expansion on a scale the West simply did not foresee. And that brings us to the heart of today's paradox. The West was waiting for a recession. China delivered an industrial boom. They expected a financial crisis. China delivered record production capacity. They expected demand to crumble. China delivered the most extensive supply chain build-out in modern history. And let's be clear, this wasn't luck. It wasn't improvisation. It was the byproduct of a system that has spent decades preparing for moments exactly like this moments when Western models fail, but China's structure, with all its peculiarities, holds steady. Nowhere is this transformation better documented than in the research produced by China's top business schools, particularly CKGSB. Their surveys do not read like the reports of an economy in distress. They read like the field notes of an economy undergoing a structural metamorphosis. Executives across manufacturing, logistics, technology, wholesale, and retail all point to the same underlying trend. Stronger supply chains, lower costs, disciplined expansion, and yes, lower profits, but again, lower profits because margins are being squeezed not by collapse, but by competition. In a Western boardroom, that sentence alone would cause panic. In China, it signals that policy goals are being met. Consider what deflation means in this context. Falling home prices mean families aren't crushed by 30-year mortgages. Falling car prices mean urban citizens can reallocate money toward education, travel, and services. Falling prices for electronics and appliances mean domestic consumption is boosted not through artificial stimulus checks, but through natural affordability. And every one of those sectors, housing, automotive, consumer electronics, apparel, tourism, has financial relationships with state-owned banks. So when households shift their spending, the banks adjust. They don't break. They don't panic. They don't collapse. They absorb, they redirect, they cushion. And this is where the West finds itself cornered by its own assumptions. For decades, Western economists treated China as a version of themselves, just running hotter. They assumed the same vulnerabilities, the same fragilities, the same dependence on profits, private finance, and consumer debt. But China built something else. Not socialism in the textbook sense, not capitalism in the Wall Street sense, but a hybrid system that in moments like this reveals its strategic backbone, a state-guided industrial machine that can weather falling prices without imploding. And so the narrative cracks. The forecasts don't add up. The doom predictions look less like analysis and more like projection, the West projecting its own weaknesses onto a country that does not share them. That's the uncomfortable truth. The West is not watching China's collapse. It is watching its own declining relevance reflected back at it, disguised as concern for China's economic stability. Because while the West debates interest rates, China debates logistics optimization. While the West fears deflation, China uses it to sharpen its competitive edge. While the West waits for China to fail, China shifts the center of global production, piece by piece, sector by sector, container by container. And friends, this is where we need to face the larger meaning. The story of China's deflation is not just a story about prices. It is the symbolic handwriting on the wall, a sign that the old assumptions of Western economic dominance, the idea that growth must come through debt, that high profits signal health, that rising prices are inevitable, are fading, not with a crash, not with a dramatic confrontation, but quietly, gradually, through efficiency, through scale, through a system that prioritizes capacity over speculation. And that's why this moment matters, because it forces us to rethink what strength looks like in the 21st century. It forces us to stop measuring China with Western rulers. It forces us to ask whether the real crisis isn't in Beijing at all, but in the Western institutions still clinging to models that no longer describe reality. As we reach the final phase of this analysis, let's step back and look at the broader landscape, not just what is happening inside China's economy, but what it means for the global order that has rested on Western assumptions for more than a century. Because what we are seeing today is not simply an economic divergence, it is a philosophical divergence, a split in how nations understand stability, prosperity, and the purpose of an economy itself. Let me put it plainly. Western policymakers believed China would falter because they assumed China was playing the same game. They assumed the same leverage points would break it. They assumed that falling housing prices, like in their own crisis, would blow holes through the banking system. They assumed chronic deflation, like in their Great Depression, would choke industrial output, sink profits, and freeze lending. They assumed an economy under pressure would respond the way their economies respond, with financial panic, political paralysis, and a desperate scramble to rescue institutions deemed too big to fail. But China's response was the opposite. Instead of contraction, expansion instead of panic, coordination, instead of instability, reinforcement. And nowhere is that clearer than in the data coming out of CKGSB, the voice of tens of thousands of executives navigating China's real-time economic environment. Their indices show falling costs, falling prices, and tightening profits. Yet they also show firms scaling up production, preparing new investments, and reorganizing supply chains with a confidence that Western analysts interpret as delusion. But let me tell you, it isn't delusion. It's design. Because China's system, with its state-owned financial backbone, can absorb lower profits without destabilizing. It can maintain credit flows even when margins fall. It can reallocate capital without Wall Street demanding its cut. It can push entire sectors into efficiency overdrive without worrying about hedge funds revolting. And yes, that comes with its own risks, inefficiencies, misallocations to political pressure. But those risks are managed within a framework built for long-term industrial capability, not short-term shareholder gain. And this is where the global implications become unavoidable. China's deflation isn't dragging the world into crisis. It's reshaping global competition. It's exporting affordability to every country that buys Chinese goods. It's forcing multinational corporations to confront a world where their high markup business model looks increasingly outdated. It's revealing a quiet truth. While the West spent years outsourcing, China spent years building. While the West chased quarterly profits, China chased national capacity. While the West debated austerity, China expanded infrastructure at a scale history has rarely seen. And the result? A global manufacturing map that looks nothing like it did 20 years ago. Supply chains that run through Shenzhen, Chongqing, Ningbo, and Wuhan instead of Detroit or Liverpool. Industries that Western economists wrote off: solar panels, EVs, batteries, steel, shipbuilding, electronics, now dominated by Chinese firms operating at volumes. The old industrial powers can't match. Friends, this is not just an economic shift. It is a geopolitical one. It signals a transition from West-led global capitalism to a multipolar reality where different systems coexist and compete on unequal terms. So what does this all mean? It means the West can no longer assume that its crises will be China's crises. It means the Western model of inflation-driven demand and debt-driven growth is not the universal blueprint they believed it to be. It means the Western story that capitalism thrives on rising prices, rising profits, rising leverage is being challenged by a system that grows through falling costs, falling margins, and rising industrial might. The empire isn't falling with spectacle. It's fading quietly, not with a bang, but with a whisper of cheaper goods, faster factories, and more efficient logistics humming in the background. And that whisper is getting louder every year, louder than forecasts, louder than think tanks, louder than the old narratives that once declared China's rise impossible. So let me leave you with this. The old economic assumptions are dissolving. The world is realigning, and those who fail to see it will wake up in a reality they no longer recognize, a reality shaped not by Wall Street's expectations, but by China's capacity. Share this, talk about it, let's face the truth together.